The announcement sounded like salvation. In capitals from Washington to Paris, television anchors declared a historic moment. Billions of African debts to be erased by the International Monetary Fund. Applause echoed in ministries, headlines praised relief, and cameras framed smiling officials as if history itself had bent toward mercy. But in Ouagadougou, one young leader did not clap. Ibrahim Traoré clenched his fist. He saw through the curtain of applause. What they called relief was built on collateral. Not credit, not kindness, but Africa's lifeblood. Gold, oil, and uranium. It was not redemption. It was a trap. From that moment, the stage was set for a confrontation larger than balance sheets. This was not a story about debt and numbers. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the courage to say no when the price of yes is your future. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point in history. Subscribe now and walk with us on this journey. Because what follows is the story of how one leader in Burkina Faso dared to uncover the hidden clauses, expose the chains disguised as relief, and ask the question that would echo across a continent. Is this freedom, or is this another coup in disguise? The promise fell like rain on dry ground. Western leaders announced it with fanfare, a grand relief program, an erasure of billions in debt, new credit lines, fast-track disbursements. Across African capitals, treasuries called it oxygen. Newspapers called it mercy. Cameras adored it. Yet in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré refused to join the chorus. He recognized the choreography, the smiling photo opportunities, the speeches about renewal, the sudden arrival of dollars when a government was gasping for air. He had seen this script before, and he knew that the script always carried a hidden cost. This time it was not written in plain numbers, but in collateral clauses. Commodity-secured stabilization, resource-backed amortization, words that sounded sterile in policy papers, but in practice they meant barrels of oil, tons of gold, and streams of uranium royalties pledged not to African treasuries, but to balance sheets controlled in London and New York. Why collateralize what we already own to cancel what we never spent? Traoré asked. The question, whispered in a briefing room, was met with uneasy silence. Ministers cleared their throats. Some looked away. They knew the answer, but could not speak it. The contracts were clean enough to pass public inspection, vague enough to conceal teeth sharp enough to bleed a continent dry. In neighboring capitals, the celebrations had already begun. In Dar es Salaam, a press conference hailed the erasure of nearly $2 billion in obligations. In Kinshasa, officials traded copper and cobalt for temporary stability. Along the coast, governments pledged offshore crude as adjustable assurance in case of volatility. Adjustable, a word that tilted heavily in favor of the creditor. Western diplomats congratulated one another at receptions, praising African leadership, toasting a partnership reborn. But in Ouagadougou, the president summoned a midnight meeting. Around a wooden table sat economists, auditors, and intelligence officers. The instruction was simple: follow the money. No speeches, no publicity, no leaks. 12 people, a single mandate, and a name whispered in the dark: the Financial Investigations Unit. Their task was to dissect every clause, every clearing bank, every consultancy tucked in the fine print. Soon, patterns began to emerge. Funds destined for African treasuries detoured through Western clearinghouses, shaved by consulting fees before a single school received support. Valuation clauses locked Africa to global benchmarks. When gold spiked, obligations expanded. When oil dropped, pledges extended. Heads, the creditor won. Tails, Africa lost. One young analyst, staring at spreadsheets until dawn, muttered words that would echo through the unit. Even when we win, we lose. The deeper they looked, the more tangled the web became. Emails between IMF staff and private American consultants surfaced, with subject lines that hinted at something larger. A phoenix architecture designed to tie African commodities into a digital settlement system. The unit marked the attachment with red ink. At the bottom of the partner deck, one name appeared in small but undeniable letters: Donald J. Trump. The team exchanged glances. Trump was still in office. He had been speaking of a digital dollar of freedom, presented as a patriotic shield against China's digital yuan. But the missing piece now sat on Traoré's desk: African resources as the stabilizer. Without them, the coin was just code. With them, it could be marketed as unbreakable. Traoré exhaled slowly. This was not simply debt relief. It was an elegant trap, a coup dressed as kindness, a new form of colonization written not with armies but with contracts. The decision was made. The world had to know. But the evidence had to be airtight. Truth shouted too early is dismissed as anger, he told his aides. Truth delivered with evidence becomes judgment. The investigation continued, deeper, faster, relentless. And with every clause exposed, the question grew louder. Was this the lifeline Africa had been waiting for? Or was it the noose tightening around its neck? The silence in the briefing room was heavy as stone. On Traore's desk lay the dossier that tied everything together, the Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Thesis. At first glance, it looked like another consultant's presentation, dense with charts and jargon. But buried in the bullet points was the missing link. African commodities, oil, gold, uranium, as the anchor for a digital currency. And at the bottom, like a shadow, the advisory line, Donald J. Trump. The discovery was devastating in its clarity. The IMF's relief program was not a gift. It was scaffolding for a larger design, to birth a digital dollar strong enough to rival China's yuan and to build it on the backs of Africa's resources. Without Africa, the coin had no anchor. With Africa, it could be sold to the world as invincible. The unit gathered around the president. "We should go public tonight," one advisor urged. The temptation was great. But Traore shook his head. Truth shouted too early is dismissed as anger. Truth delivered with evidence becomes judgment. We need the chain, contracts, wires, signatures, names. When we speak, we cannot miss. For weeks, the team labored. They mapped consultancies, tracked clearing banks, cross-referenced procurement records. The pattern was unmistakable. The same firms designed the loans, valued the collateral, processed the payments, and drafted the press releases. A closed loop of control, dressed as relief. Then came the night of decision. The square in Ouagadougou filled before dawn. Farmers arrived with dusty hats, students with notebooks, miners still in their work clothes. Radios crackled across the country, tuned to the live broadcasts. The air was heavy with expectation. Traore walked onto the stage carrying not a script but a folder. His voice cut through the humid night. They call it debt relief. But what is relief that demands our gold? What is freedom that chains our oil? Today, I will not give you slogans. I will give you contracts. He read clause after clause. Uranium pledged as collateral, adjustable valuation rights tilted to the creditor, consultation fees siphoned before aid reached a single school. Then he held up the slide, the one that made the crowd gasp. Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Thesis, with Trump's name on the advisory line. They are not canceling debts, he thundered. They are drafting a new currency built on our backs. They call it innovation. I call it a coup without soldiers. For a heartbeat, silence hung like thunderclouds. Then the roar erupted. Cancel the contracts. Cancel the chains. The chant rolled through the square, through the radios, through the continent. The speech went viral. In Bamako, students replayed the clip on giant screens. In Nairobi, miners marched with placards. Our uranium is not your guarantee. Even in capitals where governments had signed IMF deals, opposition leaders seized the moment, demanding transparency. Parliaments turned into battlegrounds. Ministers stammered under questioning. One tried to defend the agreements as temporary necessity, but was drowned in boos. Western media scrambled to contain the narrative. Anchors dismissed the documents as selective leaks. IMF spokespeople issued statements of denial, claiming Phoenix was unrelated to debt relief. Yet the contracts circulated online, translated into French, Arabic, Swahili, Hausa. Ordinary citizens read them for themselves. They did not need pundits to interpret what their own eyes revealed. Trump himself broke silence. On television, he dismissed Traore. This young man in Burkina Faso does not understand finance. He should thank us. Without America, Africa is nothing. But the soundbite backfired. Across African radio stations, callers repeated the words with rage. They want us to thank them for stealing from us. In Europe, murmurs of doubt emerged. One banker admitted in a leaked call, "The Africans have caught us. If more contracts collapse, the whole structure falls." The battle lines had been drawn. The IMF had unveiled what it thought was an elegant coup. But coups rely on silence and surprise. Traore had shattered both. Now the question loomed larger than ever. Could Burkina Faso withstand the storm about to descend? The days that followed were not easy. Relief money that had been promised stalled in distant banks. Grain shipments bound for the Sahel were suddenly delayed at European ports. Insurance premiums for African exports soared overnight. Markets trembled, and whispers of scarcity began to circulate. The trap had been exposed, but exposure came with a price. In Ouagadougou, families rationed flour. Schools shortened hours because teachers had not been paid. Clinics struggled with shortages of basic medicines. The relief had evaporated before it ever arrived, leaving the people to endure the weight of a system that punished defiance. Yet instead of bowing, the citizens stood straighter. A woman told a reporter, her voice steady despite hunger, "Better hungry and free than fed with chains." The words spread like fire. They appeared on placards in marches, echoed in university halls, and painted across walls in crowded neighborhoods. For the first time in decades, hardship did not fracture communities. It united them. Vigilance committees formed in Ouagadougou to track rumors and expose provocateurs. Students ran social media accounts, debunking IMF talking points line by line. Local radio hosts read aloud the clauses of the contracts, inviting listeners to judge for themselves. In Kinshasa, protests erupted outside parliament, forcing the government to suspend its IMF agreement pending review. In Dar es Salaam, opposition parties demanded the annulment of contracts. In Dakar, street demonstrations paralyzed traffic for days. What began as one speech in Burkina Faso was now a continental reckoning. The IMF tightened the screws. Disbursements were delayed further. Diplomats hinted at sanctions. Grain and fuel supplies grew more uncertain. Yet the harder the pressure, the stronger the resolve. A miner in Bamako declared to a crowd, "They can take our contracts, but they cannot take our dignity." Inside Burkina Faso, the political climate shifted dramatically. Ministers who had once quietly entertained the IMF program now faced an emboldened opposition. Parliamentary sessions turned chaotic, with lawmakers waving copies of Traore's documents and demanding accountability. Some politicians tried to backpedal, claiming ignorance of the fine print. Few believed them. Internationally, the debate intensified. Western media outlets painted Traore as reckless, a populist leading his nation into economic isolation. But African commentators told a different story. They saw him as a leader who had done what many had feared, challenged the unspoken rules of financial dependency. This was not merely about contracts anymore. It was about sovereignty. It was about who had the right to decide Africa's future. And it was about a young president who had transformed what looked like a financial negotiation into a continental movement. In this moment, commentators began to speak of a new kind of coup, not one waged with guns or tanks, but with evidence and transparency. It was in every sense the Ibrahim Traoré coup, a coup against silence, against hidden chains, against the quiet theft of Africa's tomorrow. But coups, even righteous ones, do not end the struggle. They ignite new battles. And as the weeks stretched on, the people of Burkina Faso found themselves asking the question that hung over every ration meal and every long queue at the petrol station. Could truth alone sustain them through what was to come? Beyond the streets of Ouagadougou, the shockwaves reached every corner of the globe. In Washington, the revelation struck a nerve. Donald Trump, who had championed the Phoenix dollar as his bold answer to China's digital yuan, bristled with fury. On live television, he denounced Traore, calling him a naive boy who does not understand finance, and urging America's allies to tighten the noose, sanctions, asset freezes, diplomatic isolation. But every insult seemed only to confirm the very point Traore had made. This was not partnership, it was pressure disguised as benevolence. African radio stations replayed Trump's words with biting irony. Callers asked, if freedom means selling our gold, then what word do they have left for chains? In Brussels, European bankers gathered in emergency meetings. Leaked minutes revealed a rare admission. The Africans have caught us. If these contracts collapse, the structure falls. Yet publicly, EU officials towed the line, praising IMF relief programs while avoiding mention of Phoenix. The dissonance was clear. Panic behind closed doors, platitudes in front of cameras. The IMF itself doubled down. Spokespeople insisted the Phoenix dollar was unrelated to debt relief and dismissed Traore's disclosures as misinterpretations. But the documents spoke louder than the denials. Translated into French, Arabic, Swahili, Hausa, they circulated across social media. Ordinary people read them clause by clause. They did not need economists to explain what their eyes understood. Collateral meant surrender. Meanwhile, voices from across the global south began to weigh in. Commentators in India, Brazil, and South Africa warned that the IMF's strategy risked pushing Africa into rival financial systems. In Moscow and Beijing, officials quietly expressed interest in the rebellion taking shape in the Sahel, hinting at alternative partnerships outside the dollar's shadow. For Africa itself, the moment was unprecedented. For decades, IMF dictates had been met with fragmented responses, one state signing, another hesitating, a third protesting. Now, for the first time, leaders across the Sahel stood on the same platform, openly rejecting the terms. Newspapers called it a continental awakening. Some called it nothing less than the Burkina Faso Revolution. And yet, as global reactions swirled, the core question remained unsettled. Would the world allow Africa's defiance to stand? Or would the full machinery of finance and diplomacy be brought down to break one small landlocked nation? The weeks of turmoil built to a decisive moment in Bamako. Leaders from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea gathered under the Sahel sun for a summit broadcast live across the continent. Flags fluttered in the evening wind, their colors blending in the light. For the first time, nations that had often been treated as clients of international creditors now stood as a bloc, defiant and united. Traore addressed the hall with calm conviction. We have shown the fraud. We have revealed the chains hidden in relief. Now we must act. Alone they punish us. Together they cannot touch us. Applause thundered. By the end of the summit, a joint resolution was passed. Member states would review, suspend, or cancel any IMF deals containing resource collateral clauses. They pledged instead to explore regional alternatives, drawing interest from BRICS and Gulf partners. The symbolism was as powerful as the policy. For decades, Africa's response to international dictates had been fragmented. One nation bending, another resisting, while others remained silent. But now in the heart of the Sahel, a new precedent had been set. Sovereignty would not be negotiated state by state, but defended together. On the ground, solidarity deepened. Communities tightened belts but refused to fracture. Farmers trucked grain across borders to ease shortages. Students organized regional study groups on financial independence. Local radio stations broadcast the refrain, "Better to lose their loans than to lose our future." The hardship was real. Fuel remained expensive. Grain was scarce. But for many, these sacrifices were framed not as losses, but as investments in dignity. In the words of one teacher in Ouagadougou, "We are paying today so our children will not pay tomorrow." International analysts grew increasingly anxious. Some warned that pushing Africa further could backfire, accelerating its drift toward rival systems. Others admitted the unthinkable. The IMF's grand initiative might collapse entirely if enough contracts were canceled. Behind the scenes, investors who had once poured into Phoenix dollar projects began to withdraw, their confidence shaken by the power of a united Africa. The future remains uncertain. The road ahead is steep and the price of independence heavy. But in Bamako, in Ouagadougou, in Niamey, the air carried a new determination. For the first time in generations, Africa was not waiting to be told its future. It was writing it. And as Traore looked across the hall at his fellow leaders, he posed the question that would echo far beyond the Sahel. If one small landlocked nation can resist the weight of empires, what stops the rest? The promises of billions never arrived in Ouagadougou. No new credit lines flowed, no ships arrived early, no sudden abundance filled the markets. On paper, it looked like defeat, a nation that had refused relief only to face scarcity. Yet history is not written only on balance sheets. Sometimes it is written in the silence a people break, in the chains they refuse to wear. What Ibrahim Traoré achieved was not a financial windfall, but something far greater, the recovery of dignity. He showed his people the clauses, the signatures, the truth hidden in the fine print, and gave them the power to judge for themselves. In doing so, he transformed a technical negotiation into a moral trial, one in which Africa itself delivered the verdict. They called it debt relief. He called it ransom. They framed it as innovation. He revealed it as a coup without soldiers. Twice the IMF tried to deny, twice the documents reappeared. Twice Trump ridiculed, twice his words backfired. By the time the dust settled, the Phoenix dollar had stalled, contracts unraveled, and a continent had spoken with one voice. This was more than politics. It was more than economics. It was the moment Africa declared that sovereignty was not for sale, that futures could not be mortgaged, that freedom had to be lived, not borrowed. Analysts began to call it the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not because tanks rolled in the streets, but because truth itself had overturned an empire of contracts. Others called it the Burkina Faso Revolution, a defiance that resonated from Bamako to Nairobi. And as the crowds filled squares, waving notebooks, helmets, sheaves of grain, one truth was undeniable. Africa had not been given freedom. Africa had taken it. So the question remains for us, the viewers, the witnesses. If one young leader in a landlocked nation can pierce the veil and say no, What might an entire continent achieve if it stands together? If this story moves you, do not turn away. Subscribe, share, and walk with us on this journey, because the struggle for dignity does not end here. It is only beginning.